What is up guys, Morton here from SteamFirst.com with a review for Krunch, an indie 2D action game developed by Grudge and Rugged, and released December 21st, 2012, and finally released on Steam March 19th, 2014 for $10. A lot of fast-paced precision action games have come out over the past few years. A couple have grown to be huge, like Super Meat Boy or that game with all the V's, but a lot of less popular ones have been released as well. If I had to guess, I'd say it's because they aren't that hard to make, they're 2D, don't require much of a story, and all they really need is good level design. The reason I mentioned those two games in particular earlier is because Krunch's page on Steam also mentions them. I thought that was weird though, because unlike the others, Krunch isn't a platformer. It certainly requires precision, but there's no platforming at all. The gameplay is pretty basic. You control a floating head with an eye and a mouth, I guess some kind of alien, and float around for 4 different stages and about 100 levels. The objective is to make it to the end of each level without running out of health. But you have a lot of health, so that's not really a problem most of the time. You also have to avoid getting crushed to death, which happens quite a lot and will account for nearly all of your deaths. Overall, the stages are fairly easy, and I blew through most of them in just a couple of attempts. There were a handful of difficult parts though, don't get me wrong, but the majority aren't very tough. There are things called creds that you can pick up for extra points, but all they're good for is points, so it's easy to just ignore them all. Though the game gets a lot harder when you try to collect them. It says on the Steam page it's compatible with and recommends using a gamepad, but I never really thought it was necessary. The controls are simple, move with WASD and sprint with the spacebar. Sprinting does drain health though, so it's not something you can use a ton, but as I mentioned, you don't really run out of health before getting crushed to death by something, so it's not that big of a deal. And honestly, that's the hardest part of the game. Sliding into an electric wall and dying, or bouncing off walls because you missed the entrance by a millimeter and then getting crushed. In most games you'd be fine, but because you slide around in Krunch, it makes it much more challenging. And that can be frustrating at times because of how awkward it is. It does make a lot of sense though. I mean, you have no legs, of course you're not going to stop instantly. But still, it's a rather annoying gameplay mechanic. The levels themselves are okay for the most part, but it can get a little repetitive. There's over 100 levels, at least that's what they said. I'd be lying if I said I sat here and counted them all, but they're all kind of similar. There's pillars that try to crush you, electric walls that kill you in one hit, spikes that deal damage, and flames that deal damage, and that's about it. Those 4 mechanics make up everything that can kill you in the game. There are some enemies that you bounce off of, and they deal damage too, but they aren't on every stage. And since you have no abilities, it's not very in-depth. Gameplay gets a 3.5 out of 5. Everything works and it's interesting for a while, but it does get repetitive, and if you aren't going for a high score, it's not very hard. The level design is okay, they're all different, but with the lack of interesting mechanics, it gets old fast. Krunch isn't super long though, expected to take around 2 hours to complete the first time through, so even though it can get boring, it's short enough to not drag on forever. As for reasons to play it again, I suppose if you really wanted to go for a high score you could, but that's about it. There is a leaderboard, but judging from the fact that I died 350 plus times and didn't even attempt to pick up any of the krebs and still ended up in 89th place, I'm guessing it's not very competitive. Other than that, there's about 50 achievements, and if you just play through the game normally, you'll only get about 15 of them, so doing all that will definitely last a while. Replayability gets a 4 out of 5. Even if the high scores aren't really competitive, they're still there if you're interested. The vast amount of achievements offer a large amount of replayability as well. Granted, if you don't care about high scores or achievements, there's no reason to play this again, but that kind of goes without saying. Visually, the game is just okay. Each stage has a color theme, so one of the stages everything is tinted red, another is blue, etc. It's an interesting idea, but really just adds to the repetitiveness. Not only are all the levels similar as far as enemies and obstacles, but they all look alike too because all the levels in a given stage are the same color. Graphics get a 2.5 out of 5. The game certainly doesn't look terrible. It has a very retro feel, and I think the backgrounds look pretty good. It's just the fact that the colors are so repetitive, it starts to get boring to look at. I mentioned the graphics felt retro, and the music does as well. There's a nice 8-bit soundtrack that's actually really good and shockingly not repetitive. The sound is pretty good all around. Getting crunched sounds like one might expect, and there really aren't many other sounds, just a few random sound effects and a great soundtrack. There was this obnoxious sound accompanied by an absurdly bright, flashing white light whenever you get really low on health, but this only happened a handful of times, so it wasn't that terrible. The sound gets a 4 out of 5. Some of the sound effects were generic, but the soundtrack was great and there's really not much to complain about. You'll notice that I haven't touched on the story yet, which is usually one of the first things I go over, but there's a reason for that. It's not that Krunch doesn't have a story, it's just that it doesn't really care about the story it's halfway trying to tell. There's about 6 cutscenes, or actually they're basically just pictures, and they show that the place you're in is a bad place to be, as if the enemies and fire and spikes weren't enough to show you that you don't want to be there. You can tell they sort of wanted there to be a story, why else would they bother with any cutscenes at all? But they didn't bother going into any sort of detail. I still have no idea if I was in a factory or a spaceship or a planet, I don't know. So basically, the story doesn't get a score because the story doesn't really exist. I could say it gets a 1 since they put in some effort but didn't care enough to flesh it out, but that isn't really fair in my opinion because that would be justifying what they have as a story, and I refuse to do that. Overall, Krunch gets a 3.5 out of 5. The game is fast-paced and entertaining for a while, but it does get repetitive. They could have had a bigger variety in enemies or challenges or levels, but I think more than anything it needed some sort of mechanic other than moving around. That V game, for example, has the switching gravity mechanic. But Krunch doesn't really have anything new or unique. It's pretty generic for the most part, and while that isn't bad because it's solid for what it is, it's nothing we haven't seen before. If you're a fan of the genre, it's probably worth picking up for $10, but otherwise there's not really much of a reason to pick this up over similar titles.